Hi, I got cut off, so oops. I'm not good at editing these things, so I'm going to just continue where I left off. That was, I was talking about by the claim of Michael Davis, who argues that the discussion of Politics 5, Chapter 10 and 11 is kind of a microcosm of the discussion of politics as a whole. Now, I was talking about the outline of in Chapter 5, Book 5, Chapter 1 of how the politic of the question of how regimes are going to happen, how regime change. And I just basically gave a nice quick introduction to that. Now I'm going to continue that. I'm sorry for the cut. And again, this is me learning how to do this and making sure that I do it right next time. And therefore, the question of how do we understand regimes and they operate. Now, as I dealt with our last little video on this, I looked at the question of, in Chapter 1, of giving us the frame of what he's going to do. Now, in Chapter 2, he basically makes the claim of that one must grasp the question of revolution and factional conflict in terms and the interconnection between the two things, that revolutions or regime change happens when there is within the regime there is conflicts, and this conflict is stasis. The Greek word stasis. This means when the people, the groups in the community need to take a stand. That they no longer, again, Aristotle's model here is that there's not a group consensus thing, but often what will happen is, as long as the parts of the community are happy with things going the way they are, they don't seem oppressed, they feel that their interests are not being gored by the rulers, that the rulers are ruling in their interest or perceiving it, or maybe they're not. The rulers may not be directly ruling in their interest, but the way the rulers are ruling the other people in the community are still able to benefit and live their lives productively and not feeling negatively averse. And that stasis emerges when the elements of the community no longer feel that they're benefiting from rule, that they feel that their interests are being harmed. And all of a sudden, they get aware of the fact that their interests are being harmed, and they feel they have to take a stand. All politics is about interest aggregation, the way groups will try to get what they want. Okay, politics is about getting collective activity through the means of not only voluntary association but also coercion. So, and a political community works both through cooperation and coercion of community. And stasis occurs within a community that is strife within the community. That the community no longer sees them, they don't either share the same values or don't see themselves as part of the community. They don't see they don't see them as the same community. They no longer see themselves as a common community. They look at a group that comes to become more powerful as an alien or no longer one of us. Now, okay, this is this causes liberal, the pluralistic model of democracy says, well, wait a minute, that's too hard, In fact, this is one of the famous criticisms of the pluralistic model, is that it doesn't realize that, that politics is going to be confrontation and agitation. In one ways, the famous argument was that, in many ways, when people are not active politically and are satisfied and are not very participating in the system, this is a sign of consent. This is a sign of that people are don't think it's important, and therefore they're not willing to do anything about it. People will do things about it when they think that it's important and they have a chance of achieving things. This is that famous line in the Declaration of Independence where it says that, prudence is one thing. Prudence teaches us that people will put up with an evil as long as it's bearable rather than to, make change that's going to bring about things that they're not yet comfortable with or understand what will happen. And it has to get, for people to accept and change existing orders, it has to really get usually bad, or the parties involved have high stakes in it, and therefore seek to change it to secure their stakes. Therefore, when we look at regime change or any kind of political order, we have to look at who are the agents of change. Therefore, agent change can not only be at the level of the social forces or the society or the factions, but also among the elites, or particularly among the elements representing the elites or the masses. The idea of these people who are the famous demagogues, right, in Aristotle's discussion of what popular leaders, the voices of the people. The demagogues who will become popular. No, this is the famous translation of demagogue by Kant's Lord, is popular leaders. They are the voices that that speak out for the people, or usually the demos, the laboring classes. All of this gives us the basic structure to understand. What is the question of the causes of factions? Why one faction will emerge? And again, this is basically tied to economics. This is tied to the you look at the dynamic within the community. What is the way of life? The kind of habits, the structures, the kind of economic model that's at stake. All of this will be the basis by which a regime analysis has to take place within understanding the economics, the economic system, the cultural system, the family dynamics, the household structures, the religion, all of these social elements. See, this is the interesting thing about Aristotle's politics. Aristotle's politics requires not only the political dimension to be addressed, but also the social dimension to be addressed. And this cross-examination between the political and the social, this interaction between the two, is essential to understand the way the regime operates. Therefore, given the structure, what are the conditions why we're going to have factional conflict? Well, Aristotle says there's three reasons for factional conflicts. We need to grasp the conditions men are in when they engage in stasis. In other words, the material cause. What are the reasons why men? What is the reality of those who are engaging in stasis? What are their material gains? What is the issue at stake? Who are they, and what is the stake involved? Why are they engaging? Who do they really represent? Who are they? Do they really represent them, or are they representing something else? You have to understand. You have to look at this question forefront. Second, for the sake of what they do, in other words, why are they doing it? What is the reason or justification? Again, this is tied very much to a final cause or telos of the purpose. And this is usually tied to justice as well, concerns of justice and ideology and belief systems. In other words, not only what are the conditions that men are in, the material conditions, be they wealthy, be they poor, be they of this group or that group. What is their reason? What is the rationale that they're doing this? And then, what is the beginning point, the archi of things? Aristotle argues that the big engine is going to be things like equality or inequality. That's going to be the big things, because of the reality of the rich and the poor. The big thing is that those who have wealth and those who don't have wealth, the many and the few, the great and the average guy, the powerful and the powerless. All of these divisions tied to economics, tied to power, tied to, by power I mean ability within the community to access wealth and means in order to live well, but not only live well, to even live. All of these address the issue of why there'll be political disturbances and conflict, and what is the reasons for this conflict. Now, here, and this is one of the most interesting elements of Aristotle in book 5, at the end of chapter 5, no book 5, chapter 2. He gives a little funny line about this. He says, well, what are the reasons for this change? And he says, well, basically I'm going to say 7. There's 7 causes, 7 things that are like the archi, the beginning points of stasis. But then he gives 11. The first account that we get in chapter 5, book 5.2, at the end of the chapter, very end of the chapter, he gives a list, and then he says, oh, by the way, there's 4 more. The first 7 are what? Gain and profit. The word he uses, klepos, gain, profit. What is the next one? Honor. Number 2 is honor. Number 3, what is that? Arrogance. He uses the word arrogance, like the sense of being, I'm better than you. Number 4, fear. People fear, Number 5, he uses the word like preeminence, like I'm better. This is that I have more status. Projection or preeminence. This is from the Greek. And 6 is now contempt or disdain. I hold you in contempt. In other words, if people are held in contempt, that could be the cause why people will engage into conflict. And 7 is disproportionate growth. Now, this means, what does he mean by this? He means by this, he uses the analogy of the body, that when something, something's wrong when a part of the arm puffs up and grows too big. Well, the same thing in a political community. If one part of the society just grows so big and changes the dynamic, this could change the regime. If all of a sudden the amount of poor people just expand within the urban cities, this is going to actually change the nature of the regime. This is why something like immigration, mass migration, can create political statuses. Because what happens when all of a sudden whole populations of people come in and therefore live in the urban areas, living off systems of social protection and social insurance that was meant for other people of your own kind, then all of a sudden now people who are not your kind are coming into the communities and are accessing that. You may not take, you might not mind helping your fellow Hungarians or your fellow Poles, but you might object helping to these people who are not your clan. In fact, this is the problem of the welfare state model. The welfare state model of Europe only worked in this sense because of the homogeneous culture. In other words, because we're all this nationality. Because the nation state was that we were all the same brothers of this nation. Why we should help our fellow Slav, or help our fellow German, or help our fellow Brit, or fellow American. So national identity, national culture, national rule became the justification for the reason for the welfare state. Now, if you're going to bring in populations that are not perceived as part of your community, in fact, this is why usually states that had huge levels of immigration tended not to have welfare systems. In fact, once you bring welfare systems into a heterogeneous society, this will cause factional conflict. Because the party that are paying for this may not like the fact that these other groups all of a sudden are growing, and they resent it. Okay, that's what disproportionate growth means. That therefore the growth of one community in that could lead to the sense of that there's no longer the sense of community, that the balance of the population, the demographic balance has changed. And this is, again, another example of this in an American context, the fact that since 1965 and the Immigration Act reform, that totally changed the way immigration operated, removing the Eurocentric basis of migration coming into America, fundamentally altered the demographic characteristics of a lot of America. And you don't think that's going to lead to conflict? Aristotle would say, hey, sorry, it will. And anyone who paid attention to Aristotle would have understood this. Okay, and this is why a lot of political scientists are just idiots in this area, because they have forgotten to heed lessons of some good old Aristotle back a couple thousand years. Oh, he's not relevant. Nonsense. So back to we left off at disproportionate growth at number 7. Now this next 4, he then talks about, well, electioneering. You know, people who canvass for living off the wages of them. Electioneering, those who seek to get political office. This can cause someone seeking political office to get political patronage. This can cause factional conflict, ambition, in other words, in that sense. A kind of an intriguing, selfish, factious ambition. Another element is underestimation. He talks about. Esteeming lightly. In other words, underestimating somebody. Again, this is the famous one. Trump, right? Completely underestimate. You underestimate Trump. You underestimated what's possible. Now, a great tactic of someone to look totally incompetent, to look like the fool, to play the fool perfectly, to get everyone thinking, oh, he's an idiot. He can't do it. Next thing you know, well, he's running the show, and you're looking like a bunch of idiots, not being able to see this from what's coming to you. Again, that's the reason for conflict. And in fact, the irony about this is that the fact that people underestimate him and hold him in contempt, it explains the resistance as well. So you have the cause of conflict, the causes of civil strife, reemerging and reasserting themselves. Next, but not least, he talks then about, this is funny, one of Aristotle's small things. And usually the small things tend to be sexual. If you read that, he had sex with his boyfriend, or this guy had sex with that, and the fact that he slept with that guy's wife led to him wanting to get that guy back. Okay, there's a lot of the small things are the trivial things that we might not take. And actually, the funny thing here is, small things are not only things like that of small personal nature, but they also can be what? They also can be things we don't pay attention to. The small things. Like a Supreme Court ruling. If you wanted to understand one of the most fundamental regime changes that happened to American, the political culture of the American states, Baker versus Carr, which basically changed the reapportionment system of the state legislatures, forcing a one-man, one-vote system, and thus changing forever the political makeup of the American states, changing the political dynamic before, which favored rural communities, now to throw the weight to the urban centers. 1965. That court decision and subsequent court decisions under the guise of the 14th Amendment fundamentally altered the political makeup of the American states. Changed it forever. Regime change. Next one, number 10, he said the small things. And last one thing, he says unlikeness, the similarities, unlikeness. Now, this is the first account, 5, and at the end of chapter 2 of book 5. Now, in chapter 3, he then goes into more detail on this. But there's something interesting. He repeats these 11 things, but then the 11th one gets not just one form, but expands to 4 varieties of this dissimilarities. He expands it further. And what's even more interesting here is the account of small things that he gives in the next chapter, chapter 4. It's a huge examination of the small things. And you'll see, if we get there, we'll see the kind of risque kind of thing that he gets up to there. But in this second account, we know some changes. First of all, the first thing, what was in the first account was gain and profit, now becomes violence and arrogance. So what was the third becomes the first in the second account. Gain and profit becomes the second one. So what was first becomes second. Honor becomes the third. So we have this situation where the third place goes to the first account and moves the other ones down. Pushes the first to the second and to the third. The fourth position becomes projection, which was the fifth position, and it was in fifth position the first time. Whereas in the fifth position here now is panic and fear, which was the fourth position. So we have this switching of the fourth and fifth positions. The sixth position stays the same. 6 and 7 stay the same. 6 and 7 stays the same. 6 stays as contempt, and 7 disproportionate growth. Now, this leads us now to the 8th, which was, again, the 8th is the same, electioneering. The 9 is the same, esteeming lightly. And the 10 kind of stays the same, which is a small thing, so, which we'll count there. But the 11th one he expands on in 4 ways. He says, well, this dissimilarity and uniqueness, well, it can be about, are you the same race or stock or not? In other words, the racial question. Oh my God, the race question. Anyone following the internet now knows about, race realism. Well, Aristotle was a race realist. Racial differences and differences of stock will cause factional conflict. And therefore, if you have a dissimilarity in the community of stock, this can be a cause of factional conflict within the community. What else? Now he says, well, what about the equal and unequal? Oh my God, and all of a sudden what happens if there's a community that's equal, then all of a sudden having inequality, or peoples that are unequal then having equality? This can be a reason for a dissimilarity, okay? The next criteria is location. What happens if the location is dissimilar? What happens if the location changes, or the situation of this? That, in other words, that something changes in the nature of the community and the structures by which the community, the physical locations of where you are changed, and the nature of the environment changed because of that, and it becomes disproportionate. That all of a sudden, that what was only a small set of housing units now becomes these big tower blocks of people. The dynamics of that can fundamentally change the dynamics of an urban setting. What was a small city compares to a couple 100,000. I mean, look what happened. One could say one of the biggest the effects in the culture of California was the extreme population growth that happened in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. What was a California in the 1960s and 70s with the population at the time was a paradise. Now, in the 1990s and 2000s with the new population, it becomes hell. You cannot, in other words, you could not afford the middle class lifestyle of the 1960s. Someone who grew up in the 1960s could have a much better lifestyle and a way of life simply because of the nature of the population who was there. Then what happens? Well, populations come in, the neighborhoods change, the building complexes change. You have to house these people in areas. Therefore, these become the south side. South central Los Angeles becomes the South Central Los Angeles. Voila! This is what Aristotle means by this. The similar. The nature of the community becomes dissimilar. And last but not least, the big divisive thing of dissimilarity is the split between vice and virtue. between the good and the bad. And this is probably the most dynamic cause of conflict, he argues. This division between the just and the unjust. This is one of the gaps that can't be overcome. Ooh. And then, again, at the end of this, section B, he talks about, at the end of that section, at the very end of on the account, he says the wealth and poverty needs to be in the same issue as B, in that sense that the question of equality, wealth and poverty is tied with the question of there being people being equal or unequal. So therefore, the wealth question is not really a separate element. In other words, this dissimilarity or unlikeness between the rich and the poor is very much tied to the question of whether there's equality or not equality. In other words, if people are poor but equally poor, then they might not there might be a problem, but all of a sudden there becomes an inequality between those who used to be of the same status. Now, these people are much better off. Resentment, anger. All of these are the factors that cause conflict. Now, this has been a long video. I have to put both of these together. I will see how these do. Okay, bye.